Dr. Nandan Kamath, Principal Lawyer, the Law Offices of Nandan Kamath. Dr. Navneet Sharma, Associate Professor, School of Competition Law, Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs. Professor Vikas Kathuria, Assistant Professor and Assistant Director, Michigan Jindal Center for Global Corporate and Financial Law and Policy at JGLS. The session will be moderated by Professor Prakash Chandar, Professor, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy. The session will be structured as follows, and there is also an element of surprise at the end of this session. So each of these panelists will be given maximum 15 minutes to present their viewpoint or give their talk with regards to the session. So as you can see, we have 4 speakers. Approximately 1 hour will be individual talk by these speakers. After that, we will have around half an hour or 40 minutes of discussion with the audience. The audience, including students, are requested to ask questions to the panelists and be more informed about net neutrality and digital India in general. After the discussion, we have an interesting research project made by students of Michigan Jindal Center for Global Corporate and Financial Law and Policy. This research project is an innovative website which is wholly developed by our lawyers at the law school. Once we are done with individual talk, the engagement, and the launch of the website by Michigan Jindal Center, it will be followed by felicitation of our individual speakers. So without much delay, I would now request Professor Prakash Chandar, Professor, Jindal School of Government and Public Policy, to conduct the proceedings of this session. Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. I must confess that I'm still struggling to understand the concept of net neutrality. Having been an economist for umpteen number of years, I'm used to a certain degree of procedure. It is humbling that I find dealing with the imprecise concept harder than dealing with the precise concept. Anya was perhaps the only panelist who came close to a precise definition. She said 3 things. 1, no discrimination in access, no discrimination in content, and no discrimination in terms of speed. Okay? And I thought this was a fairly precise definition until I started thinking a little bit more. Okay? So let me take then turn by turn. What does non-discrimination access really mean? Let me illustrate by an example. If you go to Tirupati to pay your homage to the Lord, you will notice that there are 2 queues. There is one queue for the Aam Aadmi, okay, and another queue which is for special guests and invitees. And there is an authority which decides, who will stand in which queue. Now, this I would say is discriminatory example of discrimination in access, but nobody is protesting, so it seems that many Indians are willing to live with discrimination in access to the God, but not to the net. Now, how can you see? Can this is it has following 3 aspects, this kind of managing the, darshan to the God. Firstly, it's discriminatory. Second, it also involves an overreach of the regulator, because it's the regulator who is telling who will stand in which queue, is controlling the things, okay? And it is, as I will mention, it's also economic stupid, okay? Because consider an alternative arrangement in which there is a queue which is free, okay, for the common man or whosoever chooses, and there is another queue in which it is going to cost you 100 rupees, okay? So, and you are free to choose. There is no authority telling you which queue you can stand. You can stand in one of the queues depending upon, whether you want to spend 100 rupees or you want to avail it free. Of course, these 2 queues have, in some sense, different quality, okay? Because the queue which is free is likely to be longer than the queue where you are going to pay 100 rupees. Now, I think this means, according to me, this means no discrimination in access, okay? Because everybody has the same choice. You can choose to stand in this queue or in that queue. And that I would not say is a discriminatory in access. Okay? That will be my definition. Now coming to the second aspect, that is the no discrimination in terms of speed. Now, you know, having different access to internet with different speeds are basically different qualities of goods. These involve different qualities. And I think it's a well accepted thing that if you have different qualities of goods, then you should be willing to pay different prices. But it is again not discriminatory because everybody can decide whether to whether to use internet with a high speed or to choose one with a low speed. Okay. Then no discrimination in content. That also has implications. I think that would be also, according to me, that will not be a good idea either. Because you see, content can be costly. If there are two contents, one which is costly and one which is not costly, then you see by limiting that there should be no discrimination in content, you will be discouraging providing content which may be costly, because what will be the firms be doing? They will be just providing one that is less costly, and some of the content will not be provided because it will cost too much, but you are not being allowed to charge for it. So a better arrangement, as I said, would be have these two queues priced differently, and which according to some may sound as discriminatory, but according to me, they are not really discriminatory. Let me see if I have more to say. If indeed, if the content is different, then it should be different. You see, and we are used to that if the content is different, they may be priced differently. Take Pepsi and Coca-Cola. If it costs differently, the firm should be allowed to charge differently for the same. So this is what I could think over about sitting over there, and I would now invite the panelists to speak. I think the first speaker is Anandya Chaudhary. Okay, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chandra. And also thanks to JGU for inviting me. It actually gives me an opportunity to get back into this field where I have spent quite a lot of time, more than a decade. I don't have the time anymore to actually stay in information systems that much. Some of the things which I will say may perhaps be a little bit out of date. I don't get the time to keep up to date. But I'll try my best to actually explain why this concept of network neutrality, why the debate exists. And I'm going to claim that the debate exists because it's a very difficult thing to understand. Because people talk about neutrality in the sense that there is only one kind of neutrality, which is financial or content or something like that. But it's not. In fact, non-neutrality is built into the heart of how the internet works, and that's because at the heart of it, it's a technological system, not an economic system. So to understand network neutrality, you will have to understand that there are actually two kinds of things we are talking about. One is the engineering thing, and the other is the economic thing. And unless you understand how these two are different from each other, you will really not understand what the debate is all about. This field of information systems, information theory, did not exist before a guy called Claude Shannon, long time ago in the 1940s, came up with this theory. Before that, communication was really just a plain simple engineering problem. There was no concept of packet switching, there was simply circuit switching. Basically, two people were connected by a dedicated line, and they kept hearing each other. Maybe the quality was bad, but that's fine. Claude Shannon actually figured out that the way to actually promote communication was to not think of it in engineering terms, but to think of it as a mathematical optimization term. Now, why am I talking about this? Because it's a very, very boring topic, right? It's a very boring topic, right? And that's what makes it very difficult for people to understand, because they have to understand what is the challenge thing here. Basically, Claude Shannon said that let's break up this communication to little packets, little chunks, and he called them IP. And later it called, Shannon actually didn't call them information, he just called it communication. And each of these packets are called IP datagrams. Now, the beauty of this TCP IP structure is that there is actually no guarantee that the packets are going to reach from one user to the other. There is absolutely no guarantee. Like in a traditional system, circuit switch system, there is a guarantee that if two people are connected, they will talk to each other. But in an IP system, there isn't. In fact, that's why, and that is the basis of actually the concept of prioritization of packets. Think about it. Let's say that you have to send an emergency disaster response system, knowledge somewhere, right? Now you know that that message absolutely have to go to. Let's say that you want to talk to the fire team or the medical response system or somewhere, right? You know it has to go there, and it has to be in a higher priority system. And your friend next door is simply is downloading a YouTube video or sending us holiday pictures to someone. Now, would you actually put the same priority in this for these two different kinds of packets? No, you wouldn't, right? And you think that this is actually a question of policy, but it's not. It's actually a question of engineering. In fact, the heart of the TCP IP protocol is built on discrimination. Each data packet, which is known as IP datagram, has a header, and the header actually talks about the different kinds of priority. Some are high priority, some are low priority. For example, if you send someone an email, that's actually a low priority thing, right? But if you want to use, let's say, you want to talk to each other in Skype, obviously there cannot be a lag. It has to be very, very fast transmission things, right? So it is a high priority packet, right? So, and don't think that this is something which engineers drew out of the air and just did it on the fly, but no, it's actually built into the protocol structure of how the communication network is set up, the worldwide network is set up. I'm not sure how many of you know about the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which basically decides how the internet is going to look like. And they work on different kinds of, and perhaps the lawyers would know about this. I know this room is full of lawyers. There is actually, the protocols are called the request for comments for some odd reasons, RFCs. And there is one particular RFC, 791, more than 30 years ago it was written, which actually codifies this concept that some packets have priority over the others, right? Now the whole of the concept of this prioritization is built into how these packets are sent to different kinds of things. And if you think about, for example, how the modern internet works, it's basically prioritizes certain packets with the others. And have you ever, for example, wondered how Google works so fast no matter where you are in the world? It doesn't really matter whether you're in Namibia or in India or in Tonga or Tuvalu or right in San Francisco next to Google headquarters, right? That's because actually Google uses a service called Akamai, which is a content delivery network, which basically has servers with extra bandwidth, with least bandwidth from the local service providers all over the world. And so whenever you, for example, you type google.com, it actually doesn't go to San Francisco. It goes to the local Akamai server, and which is essentially mirroring kind of service, right? Which is wonderful. So basically, Google is paying Akamai to prioritize its traffic over everyone else's, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? Now, but how does this connect to economics? Now, this is the tricky part, because like Professor Chande was saying, there's nothing. And I understand where his confusion is, because in economics, discrimination is not a four-letter word. Discrimination simply means that you are allowed to choose what you want to pay for. It's very simple. Neither is discrimination, the concept of discrimination in engineering terms is called differentiation. Again, that's not a four-letter word. But somehow when it comes to the public space and to public policy, then discrimination and differentiation becomes a four-letter word. It's a bad thing, right? Now, how does economics come into it? You see, the problem is that the modern understanding of how the internet works is it's called a two-sided market. So basically, it's a little bit confusing, but the guy called Larry Lessig, who happens to be a lawyer, and not an economist, who basically said that the internet is nothing, that each of the packets are dump, and the only thing that matters is the network, and the network is content neutral. Technically speaking, that's not true. The problem lies in a market structure which relies on this two-sided concept and realize the economies of scale. Is here again the concept of economic foreclosure comes in. What is that? It's very simple. Let's say that you're a vertically integrated powerful industry, right? And you're producing both the content as well as you're providing the pipe as well as the hubs, nets, nodes, so and so, everything, right? Now, do you have an incentive to prioritize your content over the other people's? Yes, you do, right? You do. For example, let's say do you think if Airtel has a telephone service, it is going to think kindly about Skype or VoIP? Almost certainly not, right? In fact, again, I'm sure the lawyers know about this case. In 2005, there was a case in the US called Madison Rivers case, where this local ISP was actually throttling VoIP services. A more famous case was the case of Comcast, which I think was a 2007 case, where Comcast was throttling torrent. It was not throttling directly. What it was doing is simply redirecting traffic to other kind of things. So it's basically not. It was trying to play fast and loose with the game, with the laws actually. So it's technically it was trying to say that, oh look, I'm not throttling, but I have other things to do. So I'm actually rerouting the traffic. So essentially, the economics comes into the picture, because again, people have different priorities, which Professor Chanda was saying, discrimination. They have a revealed preference for discrimination. But the problem is that the people who own the pipes, who own the context, have a tremendous incentive for abusing the trust, so to speak. In fact, I remember in the last session, some young fellow sitting over here was talking about the small number of top-level ISPs. Now, again, so the way the internet works is, the internet is a network of networks, right? And the reason why you can talk to any network is the top-level networks actually have peering arrangements with each other. So that's why. Now, let's say that Airtel produces content and BSNL also produces content, and they have peering arrangements. Do you think they would be happy pushing each other's contents? No, they wouldn't be, right? They would be trying to sell their own services. Okay? Similarly, let's not get into that. But so basically, because there are tremendous economies of scale here, there is a tendency for established players to concentrate more and more power over both content and form and pipes, and that is a huge problem. So that's why, in terms of regulation, India is pretty primitive actually in terms of regulation, which may or may not be good. I don't know. But other people actually, many other countries actually make a differentiation between whether you are, for example, a common carrier, or whether you are classified as a utility service, and so on and so forth, and you have different standards for that kind of sort of legislation. Anyway, so how does this connect to innovation? Now, if I'm almost out of time. The problem is that if you actually use, now you think about the engineering terms and the economic terms and now apply it to innovation, it opens a whole different kind of worms. So let me give you a quick, so this is like at some point in time I was trying to create a hierarchy of sort of innovation, but I didn't get the time, so I didn't finish it. Let me just say that there are actually, when in the telecom space, you can actually think of different kinds of innovation. One is the technological innovation. So it can be either creative or recreative. Recreative in the sense that people give enough bandwidth and enough computer screens or mobiles. They will be busy creating new kind of things, recreating, like apps. The classical example is apps, right? So without a good mobile network or a good thing, there is no ecosystem or incentive to people to create apps. Right? In fact, this whole app system came about because of a single manufacturer, iPhone, right? Before that, there was no concept of application development. There can be policy innovation, which is you come up with different, really, really cool ways of figuring out what you want, different kinds of different producers, different content delivery providers to behave. And again, this is a extremely, extremely complicated, mathematically challenging technology. I can assure you that it's entirely mathematical, entirely. In fact, the whole of internet works on two branches of mathematics. One is queuing theory, the other is scheduling theory. Each one is as boring as the name sounds. It's tremendously boring, but without these two branches of mathematics, the whole world would collapse. I can assure you that. But the last is what is happening in India, I suspect, is almost like a marketer innovation, that people are actually not, the telecom sector is not doing the work itself. It's simply outsourcing the hard work, the technology development, coming up with different branches of mathematics, let's say, different kinds of technologies, to actually create value. Value is happening almost at the superficial economic level, right? Everyone has a mobile phone, so people are buying mobile phones, so some manufacturers are getting richer and so on and so forth, that kind of thing. But the hardcore knowledge-based kind of valuation, that is not happening. And I can show you that, and why is that a problem? This is a little bit outdated. I didn't get the time to actually update the data on this. So you can see the different kinds of penetration in India. So you can see that mobile. So this is the lowest. India has a tendency to go for the lowest hanging fruit without actually going for the tougher, more higher value addition things. So you can see that the red dots shows in the Indian scenario, and these are box plots for the rest of for the entire world. And you can see that India is not bad. This is a couple of years ago, but so India is not much higher up. But what about the others? It's at the very bottom of for wireline and for computers. In fact, wireline penetration is declining. And why is that a problem in India? Because about 95% of wireline in India is broadband in India is DSL based, which is simply a layer over regular wireline. Not only that, if you look at the speeds of the average download speeds of which you find in the rest in all over the world, you can see that average speeds ranges from a few hundred kbps to 40 megs. Now it's actually Hong Kong is about 80, so it's a little bit backdated. And this is India. The problem is not only is it sucks, but it keeps on sucking, right? And that is the problem, because we don't go for that technological or policy innovation. What if you look at the device? So if you say that, oh no, this is unfair, you can't compare India to the rest of the world. Let's look at only the BRICS. So that's Brazil, China, Russia. You can see the interesting thing is China, that is increasing by leaps and bounds. Brazil is also not doing too bad. And there you have India. And that's a problem, because we are not innovating either technologically or policy-wise. Like in the US, the definition of broadband has changed, from last year. But here we are still with 512 kbps, which is nowhere in the world, I can assure you, is considered broadband. Anyway, so I'll end here. Again, this is a very complex topic. To understand innovation, you have to understand both the engineering part and the economic part. It would be very helpful if you understand the mathematical part, but I won't urge that. But anyway, I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of not only speaking after lunch, but also after a bunch of wonderful speakers who've, I think, captured the debate quite well. I myself am a lawyer by training, and that's what I practice, but also a keen follower of what I consider innovation theory. So just the economics of the regulation of innovation and the impact that laws, intellectual property laws, technology laws, and other laws might have on the behavior of those who are in the commerce of innovating. And by that I mean the inventors of new things, the writers of new content, and all of the things that are happening on the edges of society. And like I think Rajkumar began this morning, this is a larger public debate purely because there is a larger public interest. You can frame the debate as being of consumer interest, you could frame the issue of being of sort of interest of the businesses, but at the end of the day, we are really envisioning what our society and what our digital India is going to look like. And it's an important time in this debate. So happy to have a chance to frame this a little bit. Personally, don't have very, very strong views on this, but I've been very interested, almost external observer to all that's been going on. Interesting to hear that it's deemed that there's more heat than light. But what I hope to do here is throw a little bit more light on the things we're talking about and put a slightly more theoretical framework on it from a innovation perspective. And I think Anya talked about this quite effectively at the beginning. So this is the scene of the dispute. So you have the upper layers of the internet, which are the application layers, and the lower layers, the data transport layers. And what's happening today is all of them are converging, and the people operating in the lower layers want to have a larger say on how their networks are being used. OTT, I mean, lots of jargon used. The arguments have been made strongly on either end. One is the free speech, free internet. And in that frenzy, perhaps it's been wrongly characterized, in my view, as sort of a leftist movement of some sort, of a freedom movement of the internet. While that may be the case to some extent, but there is much more of technology and innovation that goes into the thinking of why we should or why we shouldn't. So I think easy to use labels and call people names in this, but the larger issue is on how much innovation are we as a society going to promote, and do we as a society have the best outcome, the best technological outcome? Are we giving that the best chance to succeed? So that's really the essence of my presentation today. A lot of these themes have been talked about. I'd like to, while just saying before, not nice to label things, but I would like to throw up a few labels for thinking, because I think they provide excellent frameworks for analyses. And I think all of these have been talked about before, but just another chance to bring this up. So one of the key elements, and come back to Lawrence Lessig, which is what my fellow panelists talked about. He had some very interesting thoughts on this concept of the end-to-end internet, which is that it's just the ends of the internet. So the people on the edges, users, application developers, people talking to each other, and the entire network, I'm sure my fellow panelist here disagrees, but is deemed to be dumb, which is the only purpose of the intermediary is routing information in the best possible way it can, not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it, the way the internet is structured, but the way the packets are distributed. The decisions are purely on routing it well, not on economic criteria or what deserves to be better or not, setting aside some things like emergency services. But in some sense, that argument has been taken to great extremes in non-technology contexts, especially in terms of copyright, in terms of censorship. What the ISP stands for is that I am just a dumb pipe. All I'm doing is routing data. It doesn't make any difference to me whether it's video, audio, text. Yes, I'll give it different priorities, but I actually have no stake and no say, and I not even have the capability to distinguish and discriminate between these different types of data. So it's a very convenient argument used in copyright context, saying that if someone uploads user-generated content, I'm not responsible. I'm just a pipe. To suddenly, from an economic angle or whatever that angle, whatever that might be pushing you to say that now I want to discriminate, and I'll choose that if this is Skype, I'll charge this much. If this is WhatsApp, I'll charge this much. And you're already, I think, going a few steps deeper in the levels of involvement. And as a intermediary, then are you willing to take some of the legal risks that go along, which is a larger question one might have to ask, because every time you push, you are likely to get a little bit back as well. So I think this is something that hasn't been explored as extensively as one might in this whole neutrality. Are you truly neutral? And if you have been neutral, you enjoy the benefits of neutrality. But if you are going to proactively discriminate, are you willing to take the responsibilities? Tomorrow, if you're charging specifically for a Skype call, and that call drops as one of the issues that's come up, are you willing to give me a refund for it? So there's lots of other debate that comes in, not to sideline the conversation here, but when we talk about why it's important to legislate and intervene, these are not just any standard markets. These are networked economies which have quite unusual ways of operating, and in those economies, when you're trying to find the optimal winner, they're not as straightforward as just leaving it to market. So there's a wonderful economist, Paul David, who I actually studied under, and he had these terms for where he characterized networked economies as being subject to something called path dependence. So this path dependence theory really talks about the disproportionate impact that small events early on in the growth of a technology or the growth of a pattern, the extent of the disproportionate impact that can have on final outcomes. And why are network economies much more likely to be subject to this path dependency? It's because of their very nature of network externalities, positive and negative, the switching costs out of networks, and just the whole notion of lock-in, which I'll come to very, very briefly. This is not to say that law is the only the vehicle. Again, quoting Lawrence Lessig, he talks about the 4 things that really impact the way we operate with technology. One is the architecture of the technology itself. You have economics, you have morality, and you have law. Now, there are various different times at which these have interplay with our behavior to different extents. But there comes a time, and perhaps now is the time on net neutrality, where the law must operate. The problem with actually putting down frameworks, and I deeply sympathize with anyone who's a regulator of technology, because one of the toughest things to do. The toughest thing to do is predict which technology is better, which technology is going to win. Also keeping in mind not only neutrality, but I think a point my earlier panelists brought in, which is functional equivalence. If 2 things do exactly the same thing, how can you treat one more favorably and the other less favorably, even if you have done so under an existing legal framework? So a point that might come up, and we'll bring it up when I talk about zero rating, is if you say zero rating is bad and you allow a WhatsApp or you allow Skype to operate free, what happens to the existing people who are paying license fees in an existing setup? And I think that's a point my fellow panelists made. So the 2 simple principles being functional equivalence and technology neutrality. So not picking winners too early. The issue here is that the regulator is often what is called a blind giant. A giant has the ability to make massive impact wherever he or she goes. But unfortunately, this is a giant that is slightly blind. It finds it difficult to predict outcomes. Any step it takes is going to affect a lot of people, either incumbents or future entrants. And that blind giant has disproportionate opportunity for impact. So in that situation, what does the giant do? Does it retain the status quo in terms of regulation? Does it proactively try and protect status quo? Which is what the suggestion is now, is to legislate neutrality, and the argument is that we've always been neutral, an arguable position there. Or does it allow the market to play out with all of its warts, and then you try and fix that market? So as a regulator, those are really your 3 choices. The situation we've come to now is that we have a situation where people have already invested in this technology. So there are companies who have really grown in a particular legal regime and in a particular state of technology, and that's your existing mobile operators, for example. What you risk there is that if a new technology comes in and gets the adoption rates that the existing mobile technology has, they are left as orphans, because they've been brought up and told there's a great future for you in this old model. They've invested in infrastructure, paid for spectrum, paid license fees, whatever else, and suddenly you're saying, hey, too bad, that was then and this is now, and new technology comes in and too bad, you have no parents left. Very obvious that this person's going to become an orphan. And imagine the situation of a technology that is soon to be orphaned. What is the most likely behavior? You are going to try and protect your entrenchment. And that is where you come to something, the notion of regulatory capture. So an existing player in the market, instead of spending time on innovation and competing with the Facebooks, WhatsApps, and having maybe an arm that is going and innovating, a fair bit of resource and time and money is spent on what is regulatory capture, which is lobbying, trying to bring laws which will protect existing positions. So from a pure allocation of resources, a large mobile company is spending quite a significant amount of resource trying to retain its position. And this is, if you look at it from the realm of innovation theory, this is a few steps back for allocation of resources, with, which I think my fellow panelists brought in. So should an entrenched player be spending on innovation, or should they be spending on governments? And I think there were arguments early on that someone has captured the TRAI as well, so without any comment on that. This is really the concept of where is attention of entrenched players being spent. The issue that has come up on multiple times today is zero ratings. So I'd like to talk about zero ratings, entry barriers, and the notions of lock-in in the context of network economies. So zero ratings is this notion where the supplier of content can pay for it instead of the consumer of content. I know there was some controversy in how one defines it. But what it really does is it shifts the costs of access to the supplier instead of the consumer. And that is dangerous in a networked economy if there's limited choice of the supplier. If it's free choice, open model, and you can consume any app or any content based on a small, whatever, daily fee, I think you Shota upgrade, or even for free, if that's the model that everyone buys into, that's fine. But if you're making certain choices, what it does is that it, number one, it entrenches the incumbent. And why is that so? Because there's a notion of lock-in. Today, the notion of a network means that every new person added to it adds to the value of the network. And if you're allowing some people preferential access to untouched and unserved users, what you're giving them is a head start which no one else can match at some cost. And the fact that people are willing to pay and get into internet.org or Airtel Zero means that there's a massive value, and the recognition that each marginal person you add to the network is only entrenching and further strengthening the network. And the point I might bring to all of you is if there are 50 people in this room and you're the one person not on the internet and 49 people are on Facebook, what is the motivation for you to join a new network? If you get an email saying, look at whatever, Redbook, why would you join that network when the 49 people are already on the previous network? And all the more so if Airtel says, hey, Facebook is free, it's a no-brainer. But what you're doing is you are moving the sort of the scene of decision-making to the supplier instead of the consumer. In the long run, the public benefit is really in the best technology winning. Now, what you can get in a situation like this, where I would say abusive practices across the stack, the internet stack, is that you will entrench technologies which are possibly not in the long run the best. Today we believe that Facebook is the be-all and end-all of social networks. Everyone believed the same about MySpace maybe 10 years ago. So it's a huge leap of faith to believe that today the best social network has been built. It's a huge leap of faith to believe that today the best search technology exists. We cannot even predict what 10 years is going to look like, and to allow someone who has entrenched themselves purely by virtue of lock-in, the fact that there are positive externalities of networks and you're only allowing them to perpetuate, and the fact that switching costs will be so massive. If you want to leave Facebook and join another network, the massive cost to you of losing whatever, the 2,000 friends you have, all of the byproducts of being part of that network are going to be large. And why do I bring all of this up? Because all of this matters to someone building a competitive good or service. So what is the person building the next big thing? What are they competing against? And that is the larger question we have. In a country where we spend so much of our time, money, effort trying to buy privilege, do we want to bring that whole notion of privilege to one place that has stayed, I'd say, reasonably untouched from this notion of being able to buy your way into privileged positions, be it to consumers, be it to users, be it as brands? At the end of the day, are we creating an economy which is innovation friendly, where anyone sitting on the end of the internet is able to reach someone else on the other end of the internet without massive costs of switching, branding, doing deals, and paying off people in the middle? And that's where I'd say digital economies, or the Indian digital economy's future lies.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, now let me invite the next panelist, Navneet Sharma, to give his talk now.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandar, fellow panelists, participants of this very interesting seminar. I think a lot of very interesting issues have been put up for consideration, for discussion here. Let me come back to the fundamental question which Professor Chandar started this session with, the definition. It's of course a no-brainer to say that there is no universally accepted definition, but nevertheless there are common threads which run across definitions, right? One of the most referred definition which I can take from 2011 US order has 4 attributes to reflect on exactly what you said. The first one being transparency, second one being no blocking of content, lawful content I mean to say. Third is no unreasonable discrimination. And fourth one being reasonable network management. These are the 4 conditions which this US order prescribes. In terms of the third one, the no unreasonable discrimination, the order further says that the landline, no unlawful blocking of content, so and so, so and so. In terms of mobile services, mobile telephone service providers which are also providing the internet services, this says that there would be no blocking of applications that compete with voice or video telephony services. That's also a notable part of that order. So these are the 4 things on which this I can say a large part of the definitional issues or the large part of transactional issues pertaining to net neutrality operate around. Having said this, now let me take you back to the economics or competition economics, whatever way you prefer it. Let me raise a few fundamental questions. That discrimination, as Professor Chandar rightly says, is very much the way of life. I work in the government, and there the privilege or the discrimination is the very essence of the government. Is the very essence of the government. If there is no discrimination, it doesn't mean to be a government servant. That is the lifeblood, right? First thing. Second thing, as you rightly said, even in Tirupati, in the Lord's Darbar, there is discrimination. For parents who have 2 or more children, it will be very, very difficult question to ask, do you discriminate?
Well, I don't.
Right. The point I am driving home here is neutrality or competitive neutrality is one of the fundamental hallmarks of whole competition debate in whichever sector you take it to. And let us examine this neutrality question or competitive neutrality question, or today we are calling it net neutrality, apply in various sectors now. When you go to these DLF Chhatarpur farms, there is outside a board there. Cars, free thoroughway. Trucks must pay something. So there is discrimination. Imagine one situation. Second situation, there is an online market space, right? So many of them now, and which if they are discriminating between the sellers, imagine that. Imagine a market space, any sector where you have public sector enterprises and you have private sector enterprises, and government giving any kind of preferential treatment to public sector and not giving to private sector. And then consequentially there are certain kinds of impacts or outcomes in that particular market. So that's another situation. What I mean to say is that whenever there are more than one players in the market the question of neutrality, whether it is an online market space or it is internet or any other market situation it arises, that why, coming back to the fundamental question, why is it so important in the case of internet, and why are we discussing this whole net neutrality question? Therefore, I have to bring another fundamental aspects of economics called public good and non-public good. And when you are dealing with a public good, such as a park, such as a road, such as a seaport, such as an airport, such as whatever you can think of, the question of discrimination becomes doubly important. It's not your private house, it's not your private road, it's not a private port, so on. But the moment it is a public good impacting more than one aspects of public life, and there is very well established economic literature on it, those who are interested can refer to it, the question of discrimination or compromise on neutrality becomes more important. Imagine your colony's park if the access is discriminated. It's a public good. Imagine a road where access is discriminated. Some of us in Delhi do live with discrimination because of VIP movement and so on, but nevertheless, largely it is free of discrimination. So there is a question of public good factor which has to be taken into account. Another important and again fundamental question is loss of net neutrality or non-net neutrality, whichever way you put it, a market failure? Is it a market failure situation that it require either a regulatory intervention or an intervention by a competition authority, right? In competition laws language, is it impacting the process of competition? Forget about those who are being adversely or positively affected. Forget about that for a moment. Of course, consumer welfare is an important outcome which cannot be lost sight of. But from the competition perspective, is it compromising any of the following? Number one, prices. Number one, ability to compete, ability to supply, right? These are some of the fundamental parameters on which a market failure question has to be assessed, right? Having said this, now public good, market failure, and so on, let me now raise two questions which are somewhat in continuation to my earlier fellow panelist who has raised 0 rating and questions like that. I will not use technical jargon, but rather try to simplify it for this audience. He mentioned a question of charging consumers or charging the content suppliers or the app providers or whatever, right? Who do you charge? The question is, does it exert any of those adverse impacts, market failure, my ability to compete, and so on? Let us for a moment look at similar scenarios. I have given you a number of examples where the question of neutrality, whether between public and private sector, whether or in public goods, wherever the neutrality question arises. Wherever there is a preferential access. Let's say in one of the most circulated letters by one telecom company which is engaging in this kind of conduct, that letter also contains one example that there are these prepaid phones where these 1800 kinds where you don't have to really pay for. Similarly, there have been many similar examples where and I remember a magazine which would say that or there are many other companies which would use consumer feedback, which would solicit consumer feedback, but without any charge to consumers, right? There are a number of examples where the consumer is not charged for, but rather the company which is supplying that kind of service is paying for, whether it is 1800 types or any old timers would remember those postal facilities which used to come in with some magazines, some newspapers, etc., etc. The question is, has that impacted the future players adversely? Is there any evidence empirically, so to say, to suggest that such a move by a market player, whether it is a dominant one or not, will impact the future market ecosystem or future players in terms of their ability to compete? That is an important question to consider. I'm not here to give any definite answers, unfortunately, but I'm here to raise certain fundamental questions. So that is my first question. My second question, which is again more or less in continuum to my earlier fellow panelist, in medium to long run, will companies with deep pockets elbow the charged ones out? Right? You said that, there are companies which, for example, Facebooks of this world or Googles of this world, they have position, and one is apprehending that the future players may not get the level playing field, right? Because they have taken over that cost, and therefore they will not allow. My sense is that particularly in the technology space, my sense is that there have been numerous examples of disruptive technologies. One thought Microsoft was almost invincible, but that dominance, in a most generic sense, as a disciple of markets and competition, I can say there is no dominance under the sun which has not been broken, which has not been shattered. You name it, and I will give you a counterexample where dominance has been shattered, which has been leveled out. Particularly in the technology sector, I can give you certainly examples of petroleum and a couple of other traditional hardcore sectors, but in technology, dominance there has always been a new response, a better way of doing things. And I'm pretty sure that what appears so established today will have a past, and there will be a new Facebook, there will be a new Google, there has been a new Microsoft, there has been a new Intel, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much.
Okay. Vikas Kaburia, I invite you to speak next.
Thank you so much. A very good afternoon. Well, I'm a lawyer with little economic sense. I've studied economics a little bit. So, that enables me to understand both sides of the argument. I'm trying to understand the equity redistribution which Anya and others have proposed. And on the other hand side, even though I do not understand mathematics, but I have been able to appreciate to a great extent what the argument has been. So, ladies and gentlemen, I have just 3 points here. I wouldn't be taking long because after me, it's my colleague who has to do something really interesting, a break from the monotonous tone of net neutrality. So first, my proposition will be that consumers will rather be benefiting if we do not have a strict sense of net neutrality. Second will be why competition law is not the right remedy to induce consumer welfare in the market. And third is a fallacy that if you do not stick to the notion of net neutrality, then consumers will have to pay a lot, right? I do not believe in it, and I'll give you the reasons. But before that, there is something which is interesting, which is coming from the left. And even though I believe in law economics as a tool, I disagree with my co-panelist, Mr. Sharma. Disruptive technology. What is disruptive technology? Guys, I'm pretty much sure that all of us in the hall are using either Android phone or an Apple phone with the iOS system. Before this, what phone were you using? It was probably a BlackBerry. Before that, it was a Motorola, and initially Nokia. So these are the gale of creative destruction. We repose faith in the process of market. And it's fine. No monopoly is everlasting. It breaks down. But for that, you have to make sure that there is entry at least in the market. The gates are not foreclosed. and people are allowed to enter. And every small kid, right, you know, every big giants which we see, Google, etc., they once used to be garage innovations. They once were very, very small. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, even though I am in favor of, you know, innovation investment, but I cannot discount the fact that there should be a possibility for entering in the market. That is why I'm somewhere in the middle of openness and deregulationists. Now, coming back to my points, why I say that consumers will benefit if we do not stick to or adhere to the strict notions of net neutrality. To argue my point, first I have to tell you what internet is. Many panelists, many speakers have highlighted this point, that it's a two-sided market, much like a newspaper. On one hand side, you have the advertisers. On the other hand side, you have the readers. All right? Now, the two-sided market has a different market theory. They have different economics altogether. Even if they do not charge on the one hand side, they can pretty much survive in the market. All right? Now, the second point is, guys, we need innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, innovation is a beautiful thing, and long-term consumer welfare can only be ensured through innovation. Just think about using WhatsApp, using Viber call features on a narrowband 256 KB, the platform. It's just impossible. You can't do it. And there have been so many new things which have been made possible because of internet. E-commerce, e-health, e-education, e-governance. All of these things would have been impossible if we were just sticking to the narrow band. Now, to increase the spectral efficiency, we need to invest, we need to pump in money. And where is this money coming from? Now, if we do not create conducive environment, there will be no investment in increasing the spectral efficiency. So, ladies and gentlemen, innovation is a beautiful, beautiful thing. A doctor cannot guide a scalpel, through internet if there is a lag in the system. If you give a command and the system, the robot sitting 5,000 kilometers away from you is getting that command after 5 minutes, it's just not possible. Okay, so the first point is that innovation is important, and the second argument to further my thesis is that the relationship between internet service provider and content provider is that of a complementary and supplementary relationship. They are not, they are situated in a situation, they are in a situation where both of them benefit from each other. Now, so far as the content providers are concerned, like the news aggregators, like OTT service providers, VoIP service providers, they use internet as a highway. So definitely they benefit from it. On the other hand side, even the internet service providers, they benefit from the content provider. Now, if they're on one particular highway, if there are less service providers, content providers, as a whole, it will not be very lucrative to the consumers, so the consumers will be shifting to other hand side. All right, so this complementarity has to be kept in mind if we want to advance a policy prescription which is socially optimal. However, what is happening now, that ever since over-the-top services, especially the VoIP services, voice over internet protocols have come in, they are eroding the revenue base of internet service provider. This is the main problem that I have with the strict notion of net neutrality. And many say that, listen, if we do not stick to net neutrality, then the consumers will have to pay a lot. Then I say that, no, this is a wrong argument. Consumers will rather be paying nothing extra if you are compromising on the kind of popular notion of net neutrality. Why am I saying this? Just think about it, that it's a two-way market, right? It's a two-platform market. Rather than choosing to price the consumers, I choose to price those over-the-top service players or the content providers who have become big enough to compete with me. Now, those who have penetrated the market, those who are already there in the market and making huge profits. Now, why are they making the profits? Because of me. Because they are using my infrastructure. So technically, ideally, and morally, they should be sharing the profits with me. Now, rather than charging the consumers, if I'm choosing to charge those who have deep pockets, what's wrong in There is nothing wrong in it. And because of the waterbed effect, which is an economic term, which suggests that if you have started charging one side of the market, the prices will rather fall down on the other hand side. So consumers rather would be benefiting from it. Now, there is just one caveat in it. And the caveat is that market have to be competitive. If the markets are not competitive, then the monopolist will not be sharing the resources or the profits with the consumers. And so far as the Indian market is concerned, ladies and gentlemen, we know that we have 8 players, which is extremely, extremely competitive. Even a market like the United States, it has maximum 4 players. In India, we are bleeding the internet service providers, they're bleeding each other white. They do not have the resources to invest in innovation. They just do not have the resources. And especially when you see the totality of the picture after paying stratospheric prices for auctions of spectrum, they are left with not enough money, and especially when the financial markets are weak. So if you look at the totality of the circumstances, my point is that yes, regulation is needed, but when the content providers, especially the OTT service providers, they have gained a particular strength, only then you can charge them, so that the small guys, the garage innovators, they have the possibility to enter into the market. Now, coming to my second point, why I'm saying that competition law is not the right remedy. So those who know what competition law is, our starting point is defining the relevant product market. We do a geographic market. Here I will be essentially focusing on the relevant product market. Now, defining market is important in order to find out the market share. It is merely an exercise, it's not an end in itself. Now, under competition law, you can impugn an internet service provider only if it is a dominant player. If it's an ordinary player, there are certain things which are totally permissible. They can predate they can charge the prices which are below average variable cost, and I will have no problems. Why? Because there is no appreciability whatsoever. Now, however, so far as the dominant guy is concerned, it is said that they have the special responsibility to behave in a certain manner. Now, if you see the Airtel plan or any other plan, the competition law will be applicable only if they are dominant market players under Section 4 of the Competition Law, Competition Act 2002. However, in India, the market share of all the internet service providers are very small. Alone, they are not in a dominant position. That is why competition law is not the right remedy, and hence we need ex-ante regulation, and that is why you have that paper by TRAI in order to seek different voices, different opinions. Now, coming to third point, consumer will not pay more. I think while discussing the first point, I have already made it clear that it's a two-sided market. If you let the internet service providers charge the content side, the consumers will certainly not be paying anything extra. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.